Witness, written and read by Malcolm Cowper. What did you do in the war, Grandad? Well, Jamie, I was too young to go and fight. I was only 11 when it broke out. I was evacuated to the country. That's where all us London children were sent, so that we'd be safe when the Germans started dropping bombs on us. What, you went without your mummies and daddies? Yes, they had to stay behind and help win the war. Where did they send you? To Wales. I lived on a farm near a place called Pontardawe. That's a funny name. Yes, it's Welsh. The people I stayed with spoke Welsh, but they could speak English too. But after a while, I could speak Welsh as well. They taught us at school in English, but all the kids spoke Welsh in the playground, and I soon picked it up. Can you still speak it? Say something in Welsh. Ti wedi blino bach, am I rhaid I fynd I gwely? Jamie chuckled. That sounds funny. What does it mean? It means you're tired, young man, and you've got to go to bed. Oh, 5 more minutes. I want to hear about Wales. Tomorrow. Now off you go to bed. Your mummy says 8 o'clock is bedtime. Jill escorted our protesting grandson up to bed. It was always a joy to have him during the school holidays, but it was a relief when he took his boundless energy to bed. When she came down, she sat on the settee and resumed her knitting. You hardly ever talk about the war, Tom. Surely you had a nice time on the farm in Wales. Oh, yes, it was lovely most of the time. Mr. and Mrs. Morgan were very kind. They insisted I call them Mamgi and Tadki, which is Welsh for Grandma and Grandad. To me, they seemed old enough to be my grandparents. I loved going out with Mr. Morgan to round up the sheep. He taught me to whistle commands to his dog, Nell, and it was fantastic when she responded. She ran like a rocket. Mind you, she was so intelligent, she usually knew what to do without my signals. Mrs. Morgan was lovely. She was just what you imagine a farmer's wife looks like, little and round with rosy cheeks and bright blue eyes. She was sweet and kind and motherly. Her hands always seemed to be covered in flour. What about Mr. Morgan? Well, he was nice enough most of the time, but he did have a temper, and when he was in a bad mood, you kept clear of him. He was big and strong and a bit scary. They had a son, Rhys. He was 25 when the war broke out, but he wasn't called up because as an agricultural worker he was exempt. But he wanted to go and join up. He and his father had furious arguments. I could hear them one night from my bedroom. I understood enough Welsh to get the gist of what they were saying. I want to go and do my bit. All the other lads have joined up. They'll think I'm a coward if I don't go as well, said Rhys. You can't go, and that's flat, said his father. I need you here on the farm. I can't manage on my own. Not everyone can go off and play soldiers. Someone's got to keep the country fed. You're doing your bit by doing that. You can manage fine without me. If you can't, get a couple of land girls. That's what the other farmers are doing. Land girls? They're fucking useless. I'm not having them on my farm. Please yourself, but I'm going to join up, and that's that. The truth was, Mr. Morgan didn't want Rhys to go off and get killed. He worshipped his son, though he rarely showed it. Anyway, eventually Rhys went and joined the army. He was sent off to North Africa and then Italy. He wrote fairly regularly, and whenever his letters arrived, his father would read them over and over again. Rhys always said he was fine, that the war was going well, and he'd soon be home again. And as we got towards the end of the war, they began to believe he really would be coming home. And then, one day, they saw the post office boy cycling up the farm track. They knew before they even opened the envelope that the telegram would tell them Rhys had been killed. Mr. Morgan shed no tears, nor did he utter a word. He just withdrew into himself. He went about his work and didn't speak unless he had to. In the evenings he would just sit staring into the fire. He made no attempt to console Mrs. Morgan, who was grieving just as much. When he went to market, he didn't go for a drink with the other farmers after the sales. He just came home and slumped in the chair. Then one afternoon, about 6 weeks later, I was having a sly smoke in one of the sheds when I heard the sound of a low-flying aircraft. I dashed out in time to see a Spitfire chasing a German plane, which was diving towards the ground. The pilot managed to land it in a belly flop, and it ploughed across the grass and came to rest barely 50 yards away. I waited for it to explode, but it didn't. I watched the pilot open the canopy, climb out of the cockpit, and slide down onto the ground. I saw him pull off his helmet. I noticed he had very fair hair and a thin moustache. He looked very young, only about 18 or 19. Then I saw Mr. Morgan walking towards him, carrying a shotgun. I thought this was a sensible precaution. The German might have refused to surrender. He might even have been armed. As Mr. Morgan got nearer, the pilot smiled and slowly raised his hands in surrender. But the next moment, Mr. Morgan raised the gun to his shoulder and fired both barrels at point-blank range. The German just crumpled to the ground, clutching his chest, blood pouring out of his wounds. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. But that wasn't the end of it. Mr. Morgan dragged him by his feet back to the crashed aircraft. I'm not sure he was actually dead yet. Hoisted him up in a fireman's lift, climbed onto the wing, lowered him back into the cockpit and strapped him in. Then he took out his lighter and set fire to the aircraft. Well, it wasn't difficult. There was spilled petrol everywhere. I could even smell it from where I was. There was a mighty whoosh, and the machine went up like a fireball. Then Mr. Morgan picked up his gun and walked calmly back to the house. I kept myself hidden, but could see the pilot's blood all over his shirt. I was absolutely rigid with shock. Later that day, the Home Guard men came to inspect the wreck and took the pilot's body away. It was so charred that they would never have noticed the bullet holes. The following week, it was reported in the local paper. Last week, a German Me-109 was shot down near Penland Farm by an RAF fighter. The pilot managed to land the aircraft, but it caught fire before he could escape. He was still strapped in when they found his charred body. "What a terrible sight for you to witness," said Jill. "No wonder you've never wanted to talk about it. But look, Tom, that pilot could just as easily have been killed by bullets from the British plane." "Yes, but he wasn't, Jill. The thing is, killing someone in battle is a very different thing from what Mr. Morgan did. You killed to stop the other man from killing you, but this was plain murder. The pilot had his arms up in surrender. Mr. Morgan had no need to kill him. He just wanted revenge for Reese's death. Just think about that German kid. He'd managed to bring his plane down safely. He would have been mighty relieved about that. He was still alive. OK, he knew he'd spend the rest of the war in a prison camp, but then he'd go back to his family in Germany. Maybe he had a girlfriend, or even a wife. But because of what Mr. Morgan did, he was never going to see them again. And his family would grieve for him, just like Mr. Morgan was grieving for Reese." "Did you think of telling the police or Mrs. Morgan?" "Oh, God, no. I wouldn't have dared tell the police. They'd never have believed me. Mind you, there were rumours that the RAF pilot had circled round a couple of times and thought he'd seen the pilot get out. But the Home Guards men said no, he was still strapped in when they found him, so the pilot must have been mistaken. The perfect crime. And Mrs. Morgan knew nothing about what her husband had done. She was at the Women's Institute in the village that afternoon. She'd asked him about the blood on his shirt. He said it was from handling a dead sheep that had been savaged by a fox. I didn't tell her what I'd seen. I think the shock would have killed her." That evening, Mr. Morgan wasn't in his usual place by the fire. "Where's Tadke?" I asked. She said, "I think he's in the shed somewhere. Go and tell him his supper's ready." I walked across the yard to the sheds, but suddenly I was stopped in my tracks by the sound of crying coming from inside. It was Mr. Morgan. I peeped through the door and saw him sitting on a bench, hunched over, with his head in his hands. He was howling. His whole body was shuddering in spasms. I guessed for weeks he'd bottled up the grief, but now finally it was pouring out. And I'm sure there was also the remorse he was feeling for killing the German. It was a futile act of revenge, and it only made his despair even worse. Anyway, I went back to the house and told Mrs. Morgan he was coming in a minute and ran up to my room. I stayed there for the rest of the evening. The next day, it was as if nothing had happened. Mr. Morgan was still not saying much, but he showed no awareness of what he'd done the day before. Well, fortunately, the war was nearly over, and once the V2s had stopped dropping on London, my father sent me the train fare to come home. I couldn't get there soon enough. Of course, they asked me loads of questions about my life on the farm, but the murder loomed so large in my mind, I found it difficult to talk about it. I kept saying, well, I told you all about it in my letters. It's haunted me ever since. I still see that young pilot doubling up and falling to the ground. I never went back to visit the Morgans, but I heard that he had a nervous breakdown and ended up in an asylum. So there we are, Jill. Now you've heard my story. I've got to say it's a bit of a relief to get it off my chest at last. But I'll never forget it. I still have bad dreams about it. Let's hope young Jamie never has to live through a war and see sights like that. Right, enough doom and gloom. What's on the telly?